Hey, welcome to Lasers, Swords, and Language, learning through immersion with short stories. Listen first to the story in Spanish to become accustomed to the language, and then again in English to see how much you understood. Thank you to our listeners, and now on to the story. Within 3 Heartbeats by Katie Spina, narrated by J. Arthur Scott. The story. Death dreaming could be a dangerous undertaking, if not done properly. The body dies for the span of 3 heartbeats, and the consciousness travels across the infinite plane. It was there one could locate and talk with those who had died and passed over. Iceland flipped the switch off the electric candle for her mother, as she had for the past 4 years. Mom took deep breaths, eyes closed, reciting the calming mantra to prepare herself to death dream. This was the family legacy, and Iceland's birthright. She learned the calming mantra as part of her apprenticeship. Preparing the ritual was her job. While she wouldn't be able to death dream herself for a few years yet, her mom wanted Iceland fully aware of what to expect when her time came. Mom spoke of Iceland's great destiny. But she never forgot her daughter was still a teenager. There were some aspects of the process that had to remain hidden from children. Her mother's voice was soft as a lullaby. I call upon the porter to attend me. This was the family mission. Bring back messages from the other side to bring peace and knowledge to those still on the mortal plane. For 5 generations, the Xanthos family had done this work. Each death dream was an exchange. Information received in time from one's lifespan given. It was not a long life, no death dreamer lived past 50, but it was a fulfilling one. Iceland watched the life leave her mother's body. In one blink, she was there. In another, she was gone. In a third, she had returned. Her mother smiled, and all the tension left her face. Her eyes fluttered open. With a sigh, she reached down a hand and tipped over an electric candle. Iceland turned it off. The message was received, but this time there was something extra. Mom grabbed her journal and noted everything she'd learned. It gave her time to return to the mortal plane and collect her thoughts. With another snap of leather, she closed the journal. She called to Dad to let him know she was ready. As he helped her to her feet, she confirmed they were ready to leave as soon as the grieving ceremony was complete. The extra message this trip was a warning. Her cousin, Nephrem, was in trouble, and they had to go get him. Everyone gathered in the grieving family's home. Iceland's parents stood at the front of the room. Dad wasn't a death dreamer. He served as Mom's scribe, writing down the messages she chose to share. This ensured the family would have her words to reference after the ceremony was complete. There could be no digital record of this visit. Digital records could be hacked, and these records would be dangerous in the wrong hands. The vast resources of the apocalyptic cults like the Final Epoch made them a formidable foe. Iceland sat at the back of the room in the shadows. Her role was to observe. Learning to death dream was half the work Mom did. The more important part was sharing what she learned to bring peace to the grieving. Not all information learned was to be shared. The point of these visits was to bring comfort and solace. Iceland listened and practiced repeating the words under her breath. Their ceremony finished quietly. Iceland and her parents returned to the ship to rest. On the ship the next morning, Mom headed to the cockpit to run through the takeoff checklist. Now that she was old enough, Iceland sat next to her, learning to pilot the ship. Soon enough, she would take the lead with Mom supervising. Dad clanged around the galley, storing the supplies they'd received as part of the payment for services. Currency was needed for many things, but not all the colonies had wealth to spare. Payment often came in the form of food, blankets, clothes, and parts to repair or upgrade the ship. Her family wasn't wealthy, but they'd always had enough. Iceland brought up the navigational screen. Their next stop wasn't another colony. The message from the other plane was clear, and everything needed to be delayed to check on Mom's cousin, Nephrim. Their parents had long passed over, leaving them the last to fulfill the duty of the bloodline. He was a scholar. While Mom focused on using the family gift to help the living, Nephrim used it to restore the memory of lost civilizations. Through sponsorships with various universities and museums, he restored knowledge lost to the ravages of time. He learned about ancient civilizations that had risen and fallen, leaving only mysteries of their existence. His work left him isolated on an abandoned moon base he had reclaimed. Originally built to house 20 scientists, the base had a central hub of living quarters, with the laboratories set out upon spoke corridors. When he had chosen it as a place of work, Nephrim sealed off all the labs. Iceland and her parents had helped him decorate the living quarters to feel more like home. They'd painted the gray walls in bright colors. Dad had painted a mural of the forest and a small swamp he enjoyed behind his home when he was a kid. The furniture was too expensive to replace, so they covered them in warm blankets. The harsh floors were muffled with multicolored rugs. They spent weeks turning the sterile surroundings into a place that felt safe and comforting. They hadn't been back since Nephrim moved in. Mom hadn't gotten a message from him through the food delivery channels in over a year. Her parents had risked putting the last 3 Death Dreamers in the universe in one place to make sure Nephrim was okay. But the previous generations of Death Dreamers had all made their final journey through the tempest of time since then. Her worry was written on her face. Still, she tried to hide it from Iceland. Anxiety hung in the air as her parents tried to pretend this was a regularly scheduled visit. No one wants to talk about what Nephrim's silence for so long could mean. Mom expertly landed the ship with only a mild jostle. The ship sat a short distance outside Nephrim's home. The emptiness of the moon stretched from horizon to horizon. The base sat nestled among boulders and moon detritus. The star at the center of the sun now hung low in the sky, shining like a beacon. The society that had built the structure was one the first Nephrim studied as a young Death Dreamer. It was how he learned its location and how to restore the systems. Iceland strapped on her running shoes, standing in the doorway of her quarters. She braced for an awkward family dinner. Her stomach fluttered as saliva gathered in her mouth. She swallowed hard to keep the bile down. The walk to Nephrim's door was short. What should have been a pleasant family meeting felt like a funeral. Iceland walked faster to catch up to her mom. Sliding her hand in Mom's, she gave it a quick squeeze. Mom smiled at her, sadness in her eyes. Iceland hoped this would be a nice visit, but Mom's face made that hope fade. Dad signaled the door to open, but it stayed closed. She exchanged a look with Mom, reinforcing the dread building in Iceland. He signaled again, and still the door remained closed. With a shrug, he turned around. Iceland sucked her teeth and shook her head. Mom squeezed her hand to encourage patience. She shook her head again, sick of the needless drama. Stepping past her dad, she pounded on the door, shouting for Nephrim to open it. Dust fell off the door, revealing a long diagonal gash in the metal. The flutter in her stomach turned into a twisting in her guts. Dad put a hand on her shoulder, but now was not the time for calm. Something weird was going on, and Iceland was tired of the mystery. There was an apocalyptic cult hunting them for the secrets of the universe. They were here for his sake. The ingratitude of a locked door had sparked a fury in Iceland. She pounded on the door again. With a hiss, it slowly slid open. The mural Dad painted on the far wall was the only thing lit as they entered Nephrim's home. Darkness swallowed them as they stepped deeper in, looking for their lone occupant. Mom found a light switch. The dim wattage of the bulbs added a glow to the space. It felt abandoned. Clothes were scattered about the furniture. Plates containing half-eaten meals sat on the dining table intended to seat 10. Nephrim had eaten at a different seat each time, and when finished, he left the plate where it sat. There was enough dishware covering the table that he had done this for every meal for at least 2 years. Iceland didn't know anyone who owned that many plates and bowls. Dad called out for Nephrim, to no answer. Someone had unlocked the door, but they were gone now. Mom scoffed at the filth her cousin had been living in. She charged into the kitchen area, grabbed a trash can stinking of rotten coffee grounds and fruit detritus, and set to work clearing the table. Iceland didn't want for her mom to give her an equally disgusting job. She grabbed a hamper that had fallen on its side near one of the sleeping quarter doors and set about gathering the discarded clothing. The stale scent of body odor wafted toward her as she shoved shirts, pants, and underwear in the hamper. Holding her breath only lasted so long, so she pulled her shirt up over her nose and did the best to breathe through her mouth. Dad set to making soapy water in the kitchen sink to wash every surface they could see. Family took care of each other, and sometimes that meant physically taking care. Once the mess of his physical space was sorted, Nephrim would come out and be ready to address his emotional mess. When Iceland had been very little, before they lived on the ship permanently, Nephrim had stayed with him for a couple of years. He sometimes fell into a depression that made it difficult for him to take care of his basic needs. Mom and Dad would let things fall aside for so long until the family would rally together and work as a unit to reset his life back to a semblance of control. It was a stinky, sweaty day of hard work, but when it was done, everyone felt lighter. Iceland knew the routine. She dragged the overflowing hamper, too heavy now to carry, and searched for the closed washing machine. The moon base had an all-in-one unit that was industrialized size to support a complement of 20 scientists. It had been 5 years since she was last on the base. So it took a few wrong guesses opening doors on empty bedrooms and an absolutely disgusting bathroom before she found the laundry unit. A fine layer of dust had settled on the door of the washer. It had been months since it had seen use. Iceland struggled getting the clothing into the machine while touching it as little as possible. She wished she had thought to grab gloves before starting. Now she would scrub her hands thoroughly in Dad's soapy water in the kitchen. With the whir of washer filling with water drowning out all other sounds, Iceland stepped back into the main room, walking right into Nephrim. Iceland bit back a scream. It took several heartbeats before she recognized her mom's cousin. He hadn't shaved in forever. His beard was unruly and grew out in every direction, ending at his collarbones. His eyes were sunken into their sockets with dark circles around them. He'd lost weight since their last visit. Clothes hung off him like a child wearing adult clothes. The smell coming off him made it obvious he had stopped caring for his physical well-being for months, if not years. Iceland's eyes started to water with the strong stench of sour sweat. Unable to keep her composure, she darted around him and ran to her mom at the table. Mom turned to see what had spooked her, and she gasped. The stack of plates in her hand cluttered to the table. Ceramics shattered into pieces, scattering across the table and onto the floor. Iceland grabbed a broom discarded against the kitchen wall and set to clearing up the mess while Mom tended to Nephrim. Dad came out of the kitchen at the sound of ceramic breaking. He gasped when he caught sight of the hermit. While her parents worked on moving Nephrim to the bathroom to get cleaned up and sorted out, Iceland kept at work cleaning the space, washing dishes and wiping down the counters, appliances, and table. Mom returned to help scrub the kitchen within an inch of its life while Dad got Nephrim in the shower. Iceland swept and mopped the floor in the kitchen, knowing the intent was to make a meal in this room later. Bit by bit, the moon base lost the stench of depression that had settled onto it and reclaimed the fresh air of cleanliness. There were no unkind words spoken. If Nephrim had let his external world get to this point, his internal world was in even greater turmoil. He would not come out of it with harshness. He would only find himself if given the space through kindness. Once everything was clean, Mom and Iceland got to work on making a meal worth eating. It was a bit of a struggle as Nephrim had been existing on frozen prepackaged meals. Based on what little was in the freezer, the next delivery was due any day. With hot food on the table and Nephrim clean, shaved, and wearing fresh clothes from the dryer, the family sat together to enjoy each other's company. It was awkward at first while Nephrim silently shoved food into his mouth. After the first few bites, he tilted his head and stared at Iceland without stopping, the hand moving from plate to mouth. She struggled to keep each bite down with the sounds of Nephrim eating. Unable to look into his empty gaze, she watched her parents reacting to him. Mom encouraged him to slow down, but he shook his head and gripped his spoon tighter. Dad tried to bring him out by asking what he was working on lately. The question usually delighted him. Iceland loved to watch his face light up as he talked about the worlds and cultures he had discovered. Instead of fire igniting behind his eyes, Nephrim hung his head and mumbled into his chest. When Mom reached out to rub his arm and encourage him to share, he shook her off. This wasn't a usual Nephrim episode, and a cleaning spree wasn't going to fix it. Iceland took her plate to the kitchen, feeling his eyes on her back. She loaded her dishes and wiped down the counters. Anything to keep herself busy and away from Nephrim. His blank stare was setting her on edge. The hairs on the back of her neck were standing on end. Nephrim was usually odd. This time, however, he was creepy. It made her feel guilty. He was family. She should be giving him the benefit of the doubt. When there was nothing left to pretend to clean in the kitchen, she grabbed an ice cream cup and spoon and returned to the table. Nephrim was finally talking. He was explaining he had a new grant that was directing his research. The focus was shifting from the extinct cultures and more to understanding the infinite plane. Mom was asking questions to encourage him to talk more. The look on her face made it obvious she didn't like what she was hearing, but Nephrim didn't notice. He described an organization of like-minded individuals who understood how important it is to know history. The cycle of civilizations rising and falling in the same way showed how humans never learned the real lessons. His voice got raspy when he said, "All my research has led me to one inevitable conclusion. There's no point continuing." Dad called him out on where the new grant came from. "Nephrim, are you working with the Final Epoch?" The Final Epoch was led by a group of bored billionaires, tired of their existence. They had decided that if no satisfaction in life could be found while having literally everything, then life had no purpose. Therefore, there was no need for the mortal plane to continue existing. They'd purchased knowledge of the existence of the Death Dreamers. Now they scoured the inhabitable planes across the galaxy in search of a Death Dreamer to help them end the universe. "What if I am?" Nephrim slammed his spoon on the table. "They appreciate my work. They recognize the same pattern I see. Societies rise and fall in the same way. We never learn." "That's not true," said Mom. "We may not learn as quickly as some want, but we learn. Each time humanity starts over, we do better than the time before." "Not so fast. We don't have forever to figure out how to be good at living." Nephrim's head twitched to the left. He scratched his head and grabbed 2 handfuls of hair. "You don't see what I see." "I see the same infinite plane you do," said Mom. "The Final Epoch are selfish children who don't want to share, so they're going to destroy everything." "They're visionaries," Nephrim stood, sending his chair clattering to the floor. Iceland's parents sat back in their chairs as she sat clutching her cup of melting ice cream. She'd never seen anyone defend the Final Epoch before, let alone a Death Dreamer. Nephrim paced back and forth, ranting to himself incoherently. Mom stood and approached him slowly, trying to calm him down. Turning on her in rage, he grabbed her by the throat. Leaning in close to her, he spoke in the low voice that was nearly a growl. "I will challenge the caretaker. Tomorrow is the day. I will fulfill the prophecy. I will end the mortal plane." Dad tackled Nephrim to the floor. When his hand left her throat, Mom shouted to Iceland, "Venkantesh!" It was the family code word for danger. No questions asked. Get back to the ship and lock it behind you. Mom and Dad would catch up when the danger had passed. Iceland was on her feet and obeying before she thought about moving her feet. The sounds of the flight followed her down the hallway to the base door. The door was locked again, and she struggled to get it open. There was a handprint scanner pad to unlock it, but her hand didn't work. It was programmed to Nephilim only. There had to be a manual override. Everything had a manual override in case the base lost power. Dropping to her knees, she searched the walls on either side of the door for a panel. She was anxious, moving too fast. She needed to slow down, but her blood was pounding in her ears, trying to drown out her mom's shouts of fear and dad's grunts of pain. Her imagination was running wild with what was happening. All of that had to be put aside. Right now, she needed to survive. She had to get away from Nephilim and this madness that had overtaken him. She found her panel on the right side wall on her third pass over it. She wedged her fingertips into the groove, but she couldn't get underneath the lip of the panel. It was too narrow. Patting down her pockets for anything thin enough to get the panel open, she found the unused ice cream spoon. The tip fit perfectly into the groove. With a little effort, the panel popped open. A raspy breath rose behind her. Risking a glance, she saw Nephilim standing at the end of the hallway. In his hand, he held a large, dripping kitchen knife. A dark puddle was collecting under him. Iceland shouted for her parents, terrified of what that dark liquid dripping from the knife was. She didn't want to believe it was blood. It had to be something else. Her parents had to be fine. Nephilim grinned, showing all his teeth. Tilting his head to the right, he said, "They can't hear you anymore." Iceland screamed in fury and grief, never forgetting the last order her parents had given her. She had to survive. She pulled on the manual override switch. The door slid open. Nephilim growled and pounded down the hallway toward her. Getting to her feet, she ran through the doorway and out to the ship. Her legs pumped as fast as they could. She struggled to breathe around the lump of grief rising in her throat. There would be time for feelings later. Now she had to get to the ship and get off this moon. Nephilim was running after her across the desolate moon. Iceland climbed the ship's ladder and slapped the button to open the door. Spaceship doors needed to seal completely to protect the occupants against the vacuum of space. This meant the door opened painfully slow when someone's life was dependent on that door opening and closing. When the opening was large enough for her to crawl through, Iceland scrambled into the ship. Nephilim lunged through the opening with a knife. He slashed across her calf, sending burning pain up her leg. Knowing if he got on the ship, she would never get off the moon, she pulled her legs inside. Struggling to get high enough up the wall, she hit the close button. The door stopped rising and started closing. Nephilim shoved his knife into the closing space, but he had to pull his hand back before it was crushed in the door mechanism. For the moment, Iceland was safe. Alone on the ship, she called home. Iceland laid on the floor and let grief wash over her. It started with an overwhelming sadness that blocked out all other thoughts and feelings. It ripped out her insides, tore them to shreds, set them on fire, and put them back. It was a pain she had seen on the faces of the grieving many times, but this was the first time she had dealt with it herself. She let herself cry loud, bellowing sobs that screamed to the universe how unfair this was. Her parents were dead, killed by their own family. It was worse than anything she could have imagined. As she thought she cried herself out, she would spot a tiny reminder of her parents, like a sock fallen on the floor, and the tears would start anew. She was responsible for this ship. She had to fly it off this moon. She was safe from Nephilim for now, but he would find a way to get inside. Knowing she wasn't fully safe yet made Iceland get up. Her leg was still bleeding. It hurt almost as much as her head, but neither pain could stop her. She had to get to the cockpit and get the ship back into space. The cockpit was empty. Instead of taking her usual spot in the co-pilot seat, she climbed into her mom's chair. It was her chair now. One day, that wouldn't hurt as much. Deep breaths calmed her enough to keep her wits about her as she moved through the pre-flight checklist. Mom had taught her how to do this. Iceland knew how to fly the ship. She'd never done it on her own, but she'd gone through all the moves nearly 100 times with Mom. She could do this. The takeoff was bumpier than when Mom did it, but she managed to get the ship to lift off and head into space in one piece. She didn't have a destination yet. Instead of trying to find a safe place to go, she decided to head out into deep space. What she needed was time. Time to get herself cleaned up and stitched back together in more ways than one. With the ship on autopilot, it was time to take care of herself. She slipped out of her ruined pants, trying not to send pain flaring up her leg. Lying on the floor with the first aid kit sitting next to her, she inspected her leg. The cut wasn't as deep as she feared. She cleaned the wound and used a set of zip sutures to pull the skin back together. Slathering it in antibiotic ointment, she wrapped her calf in gauze. She debated putting on another pair of pants, but she wasn't in the mood. The discomfort of cold legs was adding fuel to the spark of anger growing in her belly. Sadness crushed her heart, but rage burned in her guts. There would be plenty of time to be sad and grieve her parents. She was a death dreamer. When she was ready, Iceland could even travel to the infinite plane and see them. They were not gone from her forever. The porter would come at her beckoning when she was ready. What was needed now was preparation. Iceland went to her parents' quarters and grabbed her dad's favorite shirt. She put it on, breathing in the smell of him. It was too big for her. Swimming in the fabric was as close to a hug from him as she was going to get, and in this moment, it was enough. Digging into the back of their closet, she pulled out a travel trunk her mom referred to as the library. Inside were a dozen handwritten books and journals about the secrets of death dreaming. The first book she pulled out was her mom's latest journal. She used it to document the trip she took to the infinite plane. Inside were all the conversations her mom had had with the spirits who had crossed over with messages that needed to be delivered to their loved ones on the mortal plane. She ran her hands over the pages, touching the ink her mom's hand had guided into words. There would be a time for reminiscing once Nephilim was stopped. What she needed now was knowledge. Nephilim was decades ahead of her when it came to secrets of death dreaming. Iceland knew the basics. She knew how to clear the mind, how to call the porter, how it all worked in theory. There were secrets she had to learn. They were buried in these journals. Iceland put her mom's journals back in the trunk and pulled out the oldest-looking book, the first family journal. It had belonged to her great-great-great-grandmother, Nod, the first ever death dreamer. The leather creaked as she opened it. In tight script, the first page told the family tale of how they became death dreamers. Nod loved her husband Aegis with her entire self. When Aegis was killed by a jealous neighbor, Nod followed him across the mortal plane to the Tempest of Time, refusing to return without him. The caretaker made her a deal. She could cross the Tempest of Time while still alive and talk to the dead, but each time she did, her lifespan would be shortened. Those of Nod's bloodline were given the same gift. As always happens with supernatural gifts, there was a cost and a warning. On the next page in the journal was the prophecy Nephilim shouted about. Iceland read it 3 times, but it still didn't quite make sense. Beyond the ruins of Ego rises the Tempest of Time. Within a secret corner of the Tempest lies a door. Guarded by the caretaker of souls, the door shall remain locked. Should the caretaker fall, the infinite plane will devour the material plane, and all life shall cease. Mom had never mentioned meeting a caretaker on her journeys to the infinite plane. She hadn't mentioned anything resembling the ruins of Ego either. According to Mom, when she summoned the porter, they took her across the planes to stand before the Tempest of Time. It was her choice to cross over and give up some of herself to return. The choice aspect was what Mom had stressed the most when she explained what she did and why. The choice is not to be made lightly. Iceland flipped through the rest of Nod's journals, but there wasn't any new information. Everything else was similar to her mom's journals. Nod had documented her conversations with Aegis. She wrote down random thoughts about the burden of cursing her family through her selfishness and refusal to release the man she loved. Iceland read until her vision blurred. Exhaustion overtook her, and she could not fight it. Closing the journal, she returned it to its place in the footlocker. She needed to sleep, but her bed was too far away in her quarters. Instead of risking putting weight on her leg and sending pain flaring upward, she crawled to her parents' bed. Slipping under the blanket, she pulled both their pillows to her and drifted to sleep, inhaling their scents. When Iceland awoke, it was slowly. She'd been dreaming of having breakfast with her parents, laughing at Dad's terrible jokes, enjoying Mom's special recipe eggs. As her surroundings came into focus, the reality of why she slept in her parents' bed crashed around her, shattering the beautiful dream. She climbed out of bed, and the pain in her leg sent her crashing back into the mattress. Trying again, she kept her weight on the good leg, resting the other on her toes. Walking was going to be difficult, but the ship was small. She didn't have far to go to get to the toilet or the galley. Grabbing a random journal from the footlocker, she made her way out from her parents' quarters. Sadness fought with her absolute fury at Nephrim for taking her parents from her. He was going to pay for stealing her family from her. He was focused on challenging the caretaker when he should have been more afraid of Iceland. No supernatural being was more powerful than a teenage girl's rage. Iceland flipped through the journal as she ate breakfast. She wasn't hungry and the food tasted like sand in her mouth, but she knew her parents would be disappointed if she didn't eat. If she didn't take care of herself, they would know when she traveled to the infinite plane to talk to them. As she read the words of her ancestors, she looked for the last piece of information she didn't have. Mom had shared how to cross the infinite plane, but she hadn't gotten to the part about coming back. They had thought there were years still. Nephrim would regret leaving her alive. She hadn't been ready to death dream before. Now, breakfast sat like a stone in her stomach and vengeance burned its way through her veins. She was ready to call the porter. After cleaning up the breakfast dishes, she went back to her parents' quarters. Mom stored her electric candles in another box in the closet. When Mom was the one death dreaming, they did the ritual in the main cabin of the ship. Iceland wasn't up for more walking, and she wanted the comfort of being near her parents' things. Setting herself on the floor, she placed the candle in front of her. She wasn't sure if she should turn it on and then move through the calming mantra, or if it was better to prepare and then turn on the candle. Since she was alone, she decided turning it on first was best. She flicked the switch, and the electric flame burst to life. It flickered, as though dancing in a breeze of her breath. Iceland sat back, stretching out her leg to ease the tension in the sliced muscle. Closing her eyes, she struggled to pull the attention away from the ache in her leg and focus inward. Once she stopped thinking about how angry she was, how sad she was, how lonely she was, and how much her leg hurt, she peeked at the candle. The light had dimmed as its power source drained. Focus under these conditions was hard. The calming mantra came to her from deep within her memories. Mom made her practice it every day for the past 2 years, but she had never managed to actually feel calm. Now her emotions were a torrential storm roiling inside her, and yet being calm was more important than ever. She whispered the words to herself, making the sound of them bring her to a momentary peace. Each piece was connected to a color. She visualized a bright yellow star. Yellow is the sun, warm on my face. She pictured a massive green field she had run through for hours on a planet whose name she had long forgotten. Green is for a life worth living. Blue was a vast expanse of water that stretched from a beach beneath her feet out to the horizon and beyond. Blue is to be like water, changing everything it touches. Pressing her hands onto the floor beneath her, she invited darkness to take her. Black keeps me grounded. She ran through the mantra over and over, breathing more slowly each time, feeling the rage temper itself with her need to death dream. When the words had calmed her enough, Iceland took a deep breath in. With all the authority a 16-year-old orphan alone on a spaceship floating in space could muster, she said, "I call upon the porter to attend me." At first, all remained dark. A sliver of light appeared as a door within her opened. Iceland felt the weight of all that sat beyond that door. The slice of light grew to a full rectangle as the door opened fully. A hand so dark it looked to be made of hardened shadows stretched out from within a heavy, midnight blue robe sleeve. A voice at the back of her mind whispered she should be afraid, but she couldn't find that feeling. This was her birthright, a family legacy passed down for generations, and she was about to fulfill a grand purpose. Many lived their whole lives never experiencing this sense of certainty. Iceland took the hand and passed through the door. On the other side was a massive ancient city in ruins. Stone and marble structures collapsed on themselves. Silence sat heavy like a blanket. This was the ruins of Ego mentioned in the prophecy. Beyond this city was the tempest of time. Iceland looked around, but the porter had left. Sand whispered behind her feet as she passed through the eerie, quiet streets. Partially collapsed buildings rose high around her. Weaving her way through the streets, Iceland felt a connection to this space. An invisible thread pulled her through the ruins, tugging at her core. Here, in this abandoned wasteland, her thoughts wandered from her purpose for crossing planes and returned to her rage at Nephrim. She struggled to fight the fury burning through her patience as the ruined city continued on. Mom had never mentioned this place in any of her descriptions of death dreaming. It wasn't in any of the other family journals. Its only mention was in the prophecy. Dwelling on Nephrim and the prophecy cooled her anger into a fear that she was too late. If she was trapped within the ruins of Ego, perhaps Nephrim had already come to challenge the caretaker. Hopelessness crammed its way into her thoughts and overpowered her feet from moving forward. If Nephrim had already challenged the caretaker, all was lost. Her journey to see her parents for help was pointless. The shuffling sounds of her feet stopped. Her ears recognized she'd stopped moving before her brain did. A teenager had crossed to the infinite plane to talk to her mom and dad. She was pathetic. Nephrim knew she was no threat. She didn't even know how to cross back to the mortal plane now that she was here. Iceland fell to one knee as doubt made her body heavy. Instead of reinforcing the feelings of worthlessness, her body collapsing reminded her that here she didn't have the weakness of her body. The leg wound was back on the mortal plane with her physical body. The limitations of mortal existence did not affect her here. She didn't need to eat, to sleep, to breathe. The stones in the buildings around her rattled as they shifted in their foundations. Iceland rose to her feet and bellowed a command to the universe to release her from this place. She would not be hampered by mortal doubts. Her bloodline gave her a connection to the infinite. She felt it press against her thoughts as she cleared away the feelings that did not serve her. The infinite called to her, and she answered. Within 10 steps, she came to a vast stretch of emptiness. Beyond was a wall made of tumultuous storm clouds resting on the ground and rising high into the infinite space above. Gray storm clouds roiled and tumbled over each other as they climbed to reach the top. Weaving between them were wisps of lighter gray, dancing in the winds made by movement. Lightning flashed within. As one streak thrust upward, another shot downward. The wall of storm clouds felt too far away for her to be able to walk up to it without exhausting herself. The twinge of hopelessness tried to sneak out of the box in her mind that Iceland had crammed it into, but she gave it no purchase. The mortal plane called for a defender. Iceland was the defender. So she set her feet to the task of getting her to the wall of storms. Each stride took her 10 times farther than one on the mortal plane, and before she realized it, she stood an arm's length from the tempest of time. Beyond this wall of storms were her parents, and the remaining answers she needed to save the universe. Iceland didn't stop to think about what she was doing. She plunged into the tempest of time. The storm clouds were cool and damp against her skin as she moved deeper. Lightning flashed far above her, but never came close to striking her. As a death dreamer, she was welcome here. Pressing through the clouds, she emerged into a new universe of brightness. There was no ground beneath her feet, yet she stood firm. Mom's lessons hadn't gotten to the part of summoning a soul after passing through the tempest of time. Taking her best guess, Iceland called out her parents' names to the infinite. With her declaration made, she waited. Time did not exist here. She had forever to wait, and when she returned to her body, it would be the same 3 heartbeats it was for her mom. Iceland looked around, trying to find something to focus her attention on, so she wouldn't fall back into the rage and hopelessness that had stalled her in the ruins of ego. Everything here was bright. Light had form. Tiny balls of colored light shone and twinkled like stars, bouncing through the space. The quiet in the air held a peace that the silence of the ruins of ego lacked. Iceland sighed. Her parents would find her soon, and she would get her answers. A pair of stars, one blue, one purple, drifted in a path that led them to her. A smile spread across her face as she recognized the love radiating from them as her parents. The purple light pressed against her left cheek. She connected with the soul of her dad. All his memories of her and his love for their family poured into her, filling her nearly to bursting. Iceland whispered her love back to her dad's soul as she disconnected from her and drifted away to float in her eye line. The blue light of her mom hesitated to come closer. She hovered just out of reach. The distance broke Iceland's heart. Unable to wait for her mom to get over her reticence, she leapt forward and pulled the blue light to her heart. All her mom's knowledge of death dreaming, of the prophecy, of the family burden flooded Iceland's mind. As the love her mom held for her wrapped her in a warm embrace, her parents' apologies for hiding the truth from her rose to the surface of her thoughts. Mom's blue light moved away to hover next to Dad's purple light. Iceland stared at the lights of her parents' souls. Having gained all the knowledge they had to share with her, she understood why they had died to give her time to flee. The weight of responsibility sat heavy on her shoulders. Someone who hadn't been raised to embrace the significance of their gifts would have buckled under the pressure. Blowing kisses to her parents, Iceland turned back to the tempest of time and stepped through. As she passed through the roiling wall of storms, she felt the thin tendrils of life being stripped from her. This was the cost of meeting the souls who had passed, and she paid it gladly. Her mom had given her more than knowledge of how to return to the mortal plane. In the apologies and excuses, her mom revealed that Iceland was more than a death dreamer. She felt the press of the infinite against her psyche because she was the key to maintaining the barrier between planes. Iceland was the caretaker of the prophecy. She emerged on the other side of the wall to see Nephrim in the distance. He knelt low, faced away from her. Though he was far away, she heard his words clearly. I, Nephrim, of the Death Dreamer bloodline, challenge the caretaker to face me. The mortal plane has forsaken its chances to grow beyond its limitations. I will end this. Iceland should have been afraid. This man had killed her parents, and he had come to kill her. He was a murderer, with the self-assurance of a zealot. There would be no rationalizing with him. The last thing Mom had shared with her was the certainty that Nephrim could not leave the infinite plane ever again. Iceland must ensure it. Taking a deep breath to steel herself, she walked toward him. He turned, spotting her. Finally, he shouted. When Iceland got close enough for him to really see his face hardened into a mask of hatred. It can't be you, shouted Nephrim as he stormed towards her. Spittle flew from his lips as he spat angry words at her. You're a child. Iceland felt the infinite plane pressing against her from within and without. The tempest of time rose high behind her. Looking into the face of her parents' murderer, Her rage fizzled away. Isolated in his moon base, Nephilim shut himself away from the relationships that would have shown him civilization could do better. He was not a fierce monster to be slain. He was a pathetic, lonely man who had let himself be convinced his arrogance was more important than the lives of everyone in the universe. Nephilim joined the final epoch, certain life was hopeless. Life was not a sum of mistakes. It was hope, growth, and love. Iceland opened her mouth to try to convince him the universe was not as bleak as he thought. He lunged for her, his hands clasped around her throat. Madness burned in his eyes as he stared at her. She pulled against his hands, struggling to get air past his grip, but it was futile. Darkness crept in at the edges of her vision. Nephilim squeezed harder, a wordless rage bellowed from him, sending spittle on her cheeks. The wetness jerked Iceland from her stupor. Dad had taught her better than this. She was being attacked by someone with an obvious weak point. She stepped into his grasp, then forced her knee between his legs. The jolt of pain loosened his grip, so she did it again. Hands left her throat. She gasped in a lungful of air. He lunged for her again, and she fell onto her backside and rolled away. "I am the caretaker," she whispered to herself. Those words tasted like sunshine and spun sugar. This was the secret her parents had died to protect. The truth of them settled on her like a warm blanket around her shoulders. This was her domain. She would not let Nephilim take anything else from her. Rising to her feet, Iceland stretched her arm with a palm out to stop him from attacking her again. One deep breath in, she felt the ruins of ego singing to her, asking to be made of use. Power and knowledge flowed through and around her, desperate to be used. Nephilim froze in place in mid-stride. His left leg wobbled as he balanced on it, right leg extended out beyond him. This rage on his face contorted his features, making him unrecognizable. "I am the caretaker," said Iceland, waking up to him. "I was always coming here. I have always been here. I will always be here. You have been deceived." Pressing her hand against his chest, she pushed him backward. Iceland pushed him until he was enveloped by the roiling wall of storm clouds. The anger left him within the tempest of time, years stripped from his body as the storm moved through him, taking with it his fear and his loneliness. Iceland watched him age rapidly. Wrinkles formed on his face. His back stooped, his knees shook. She stared straight into his eyes as the threads of life were pulled out of him. The fire burning in his eyes faded, then winked out. With clarity he hadn't had in years, his ancient face smiled at her. Though she could not hear him over the mighty winds, she saw his mouth form the words, "Thank you." Then he was gone. His mortal years were stripped from his body, and his soul moved beyond the wall to join the others in the infinite. Iceland dropped her hand, sunk to the ground, and wept. She shed every tear she had for Nephilim, her parents, the members of an apocalyptic cult who were so lost and lonely they believed the universe was better off not existing. Once she had cried herself out, Iceland rose to her feet. She called to the porter once more, and the shadowy figure in deep blue robes appeared before her. She stretched out her hand for the shadow to take. Now that she was here, she remembered everything. Rather, she learned everything she would one day remember. Time was a tricky thing in a plane where it did not exist. Iceland was a caretaker. She had been the one to bargain with Nod, and she was the descendant of Nod. The ruins were the physical manifestation of her ego, broken and sacrificed for the protection of the mortal plane. The porter, the silent being who shepherded her family across the plains for generation, was her shadow self, born of her greatest desire to protect life. There were still years for her to live on the mortal plane, friendships to make, messages to carry over, and lives to heal. Once her time on the mortal plane was ended, so too would the Death Dreamers. The mortal plane would be protected from those who sought to spur on its end. Iceland opened her eyes and turned off the candle. The end. Thank you for listening to Within 3 Heartbeats by Katie Spina, narrated by J. Arthur Scott. Laser Swords and Language believes that learning a new language should be accessible to everyone, but that it should be fun as well. If you enjoyed our story, please like the video and subscribe to our channel. We'd also like to thank our narrators, authors, and artists who work hard to make this video possible. Please show them the support by visiting them on their social media and websites and following along with supporting their other projects. Thank you again for listening. We hope to see you again in the next video as we continue to learn more together. We wish you good luck on your language learning journey. Until then.